Please join me in welcoming this week's speaker, Dr. Elsa Ordway, from here at UCLA. She's in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. I want to read this one sentence from your lab website where you describe yourself as an interdisciplinary ecosystem ecologist. And we're going to get to hear about that interdisciplinarity today. She's going to focus, I think, more specifically in the Congo region for your talk. But broadly speaking, Elsa's interested in the tropics more generally, and she's working towards some new projects in that area, so we might be able to learn a bit about that during the Q&A. So without any hesitation, please welcome me in joining Dr. Ordway to Back This Week.
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation to be here. I've actually only been at UCLA since 2021, which I was saying feels like both yesterday and a decade ago for all sorts of reasons that you all are familiar with. But it's nice to actually be able to see a different community of folks on campus too, so I'm really excited to share my work with you. I do want to provide a disclaimer. I don't do work on evolution. I don't do work on behavior. I do a lot of work on plants, but from across a lot of different scales. And I do work with people quite a bit, and I think you'll see how that comes in. What I'd like to get out of today is actually to kind of give you an overview of the different kinds of projects we work on in my group. And at the end, especially thinking about future research, I want to talk about some of the work I'm doing in collaboration with a lot of folks here and abroad that may spark some interest among you all. And hopefully we can get into some of that in conversation too. So I am going to talk about work I do mostly in the tropics today, and a lot of the kind of the core themes that bring projects together in my group are thinking about forest systems and how those are responding to climate change and land use change. And then a tool we use a lot in my group is remote sensing data, so airborne and satellite imagery. You're actually seeing an example of that kind of data in the background here. This is LiDAR data, so this is actual data, and it's colored by height. So this is a system in Southeast Asia. And it's actually an oil palm plantation in the foreground, and then a forest reserve in the background with much more heterogeneous canopy height, and then a mangrove all the way in the back. So I'll come back to that in one part of my talk where I actually will talk about some of my work in Asia. I first want to just acknowledge my group. There's a lot of work that they are doing that I'm not at all going to talk about today that's also really exciting, including work here in California as well. So we do work in the tropics and California. But I just want to spotlight them for just a minute before unfortunately moving on to not talk about much of their work today. So, to set the stage for where I'm going to go, I want to start by emphasizing something that I think probably many of you are quite aware of, which is the fact that terrestrial ecosystems are under huge amounts of pressure in the form of both climate change and land use change. So land use change, I'm talking about expanding cropland and pasture. You're seeing an example of that in Rondônia, Brazil, where you're seeing this time series of satellite imagery showing this agricultural expansion in a region. There's also a lot of logging and urbanization that's happening that's placing a lot of pressure on these systems. And with climate change, there's things like burned area associated with fires, which are actually important parts of a lot of systems, ecosystems, but those are changing in terms of their frequency and severity in ways that are resulting in changes that we're kind of unable to understand and keep up with that have really big implications. And in particular, tropical forests are intricately linked to a lot of these changes, which is why I focus on them. They cover less than 10% of the ice-free land surface, but they're hugely important given that small, relatively small land area that they're covering. They have about 2/3 of all species on Earth are in and from the tropics. They're home to over 3 billion people. And they contribute hugely to global and regional climate systems. There's these huge energy and water pumps that are the kind of underpinning of a lot of climate systems. I think a lot about the carbon cycle. So NPP here is net primary productivity. These systems account for about 30% of all terrestrial net primary productivity. And they store, if you're talking about the stocks, not the fluxes, they store about 25 to 40% of terrestrial biomass, carbon, right? So that's a really important natural sink that's pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. This is just kind of a figure to emphasize that. So this is showing on the y-axis latitude, so the equator's at 0, and biomass stocks on the x-axis, and these are estimates. And they're saying potential biomass stocks or actual, where potential would be if we were to restore areas that have been degraded. Either way you look at it, there's this huge peak at the equator, right, in the tropics. We know there's a huge amount of biomass stored there that's critically important. They're also under really intense pressure compared to a lot of other parts of the world, mostly in the form of deforestation and degradation. This is from a publicly available data set, and it's showing loss, tree cover loss, which some people specifically call deforestation. We can get into that in Q&A later if people are interested. But it can be thought of as deforestation. And you're seeing all areas in red indicating loss since the year 2000. And these are just snapshots. And just since 2000, and I honestly need to update these numbers, but the amount of forest loss in the tropics that's occurred is equivalent to an area larger than the combined area of California, Nevada, Washington, and Oregon. And that's still continuing on a daily basis, right? So this is a huge amount of loss and pressure on these ecosystems that a lot of different species depend on, including our own. I mentioned also briefly that these are really important carbon sinks. I like to show this map because I think it's just a really beautiful depiction. This is actual data underpinning this, and you're seeing kind of in an elevation map, you're actually seeing carbon instead of elevation. So the green areas that kind of pop out are areas that have more carbon. You can see California has some areas that are popping out because of a lot of carbon stored in ecosystems here. But across the tropics, there's this kind of green belt that pops out because of how much carbon that's stored there. The issue, though, is that we don't know what's going to happen to that carbon because of all these changes. In combination between land use change and climate change, there's a lot of pressure on these systems that we're trying to understand, and we're trying to understand the implications for how carbon is going to stay in this system. These are a bunch of models that are projecting out that terrestrial carbon sink into the future, and there's differences with these models that I can get into if there's questions, but these projections don't even agree on the sign of change. So any model projection that simulates above an ending point of above zero suggests that those systems will continue to pull carbon out of the atmosphere by the end of the century. They'll continue to be sinks of carbon, right, and serve as this important natural mitigation approach. Any line that ends up below zero suggests that those systems are going to do actually the opposite. They're going to put more carbon into the atmosphere, and they're going to become a part of the problem instead of a part of the solution. So these models don't even agree on what these systems are going to be doing. And this is all terrestrial systems. There's other work that shows that most of that uncertainty is because of our lack of understanding of what's going on in the tropics. There's three times greater uncertainty with these models in the tropics than other parts of the world. I would argue that a big part of what's really complicating our ability to understand these systems is the huge amount of diversity. And I'm talking about diversity in terms of species diversity, cultural diversity, structural diversity. We tend to treat these systems as a monolith and refer to tropical forests as a single thing, when in fact they're hugely heterogeneous, right, across all of these different dimensions that we're interested in. And this is just showing you an example across these different systems that are thought of kind of phylogenetically. You know, what are the differences in tree species diversity per hectare, or gross primary productivity, again, thinking about carbon, or forest height, kind of the differences in structure. They're hugely different across these systems. And actually a study that uses the kind of data I use, remote sensing data, when we looked at a climate extreme, an El Nino year in 2015, which is kind of our ability to get a glimpse into these future climate changes, is to look at what happens when these extreme events occur. This study suggests that actually these sinks are very fragile, and all of these sinks turned to carbon sources after that El Nino year, after a period of major drought, but for really different reasons. So in the case of the Americas, there was reduced plant growth that led to more emissions to the atmosphere. In the case of Africa, it was respiration, which is a byproduct of photosynthesis. That was heightened, so there was more emissions to the atmosphere from that. In Asia, it was land use. It was fires associated with people clearing and burning for agriculture. And that was the source of greater emissions in Asia. So this is just one snapshot in time in response to an extreme event, but it suggests that there's very different things at play across these different continents that we're otherwise treating as a single system. And this is another example of kind of how that may have some subtle discrepancies with what's going on in the ground. So that study I just showed you is a remote sensing analysis from space. There's 2 other studies that have come out recently that suggest a slightly different story using forest plot data from the ground. So on the left, there was a study that looked at comparing long-term tree plot, forest plot, inventory plot dynamics in the Amazon and Africa. And according to these forest inventory plot data, they showed that there's a lot more tree mortality in the Amazon that's leading to an unstable sink that's leading to that source of emissions. But in Africa, that doesn't seem to be happening. Mortality is lagging in trees. Tree mortality is lagging. So they're saying it's an asynchronous sink and it's just a lag effect. This other plot looked specifically at African forest plots after the El Nino and looked at pre and post El Nino, what happened to carbon sequestration capabilities of those trees. And they say it's actually a really resistant system in Africa because, yes, the net change in carbon did decline, but it stayed above 0, even after the 2015 El Nino. So yeah, it's sensitive and it's responding, but it's resisting change. It's still a solid sink. So we're getting these different stories that are telling us different things, but somewhat maybe indicating that Central African systems are more resistant or more resilient compared to others. And at the end of the day, what my research tries to do, and I'm going to talk about a few different threads of research. Increasingly, I'm trying to move into understanding what's making Central African systems so different. Are they truly different, in fact, and why? And can we expect that to last? But I'll talk about some other work as well that looks at other systems like in Southeast Asia. And all of my work tries to work across these different disciplinary threads, pulling on kind of social and ecological systems approaches where we think about the economic and political context and sometimes cultural context. We're thinking about diversity and structural and functional responses in terms of the ecosystem. So I'll talk about a couple. In part 1 and part 2, I'll talk about work that I have done to think about kind of the impact of people on ecosystems and then how those ecosystems are responding to some of this kind of change. And in part 3, I really want to get to some examples of things that I'm actively working on with a lot of collaborators right now that are trying to slowly move towards tighter integration of these things. Often they're done in, you work on the social, you work on the ecological, and then you try to piece it together at the end, which is ultimately, honestly, easier to do. But I do think we can get a lot more from this tighter interdisciplinary research. So first, I'm gonna talk about oil palm expansion as one pathway to deforestation, which I think is an important way to kind of zoom in and better understand what's going on when we're talking about deforestation in the tropics. Oil palm, raise your hand, have you ever heard of oil palm or palm oil? Okay, so people are familiar. I think by this point it's gotten enough attention in the media, but the reason being is in part because it's led to so much forest loss, right? It is a major contributor to deforestation. It's actually one of many different oil crops that are actually very substitutable. So you're not actually consuming oil palm directly most of the time. You're consuming it as a product, as a product that it is in. And that oil in that product could be rapeseed oil or soybean oil or sunflower oil. The reason it's palm oil, is in part because palm oil is cheap to produce, it's incredibly high yielding, and there's markets for it that allow for that to get into these supply chains. So it is taken off in a big way because of its profitability relative to these other oil crops in the last few decades. The other thing, unlike something like soy, for example, which you may know grows here in the US, it can be grown in lots of parts of the world, palm oil can only be grown about 10 degrees north and south of the equator. It's restricted to being grown in the tropics. So it's this really direct pressure on tropical ecosystems. Because of the amount of deforestation it has caused, there's a lot of efforts to try to reduce production and or reduce deforestation associated with production. The approach to dealing with that is the supply chain approach. So what do I mean by supply chain approach? These different zero deforestation efforts are focused on understanding the whole supply chain from production to your version of consumption, wherever that may be. There's this whole suite of things that happens. Where along that chain can we understand kind of how to leverage that part of the system and say we can improve sustainability there? And so people from kind of business approaches think about these different nodes in the system and have said, well, we think where, after it's trucked to a mill, that's where it's going to be a really good place to improve the sustainability, because we can certify all producers who supply to that mill. And this has been based on systems in Southeast Asia where a lot of production has happened and deforestation has happened. I looked at this in Cameroon. So this crop is actually originally from Cameroon. It's a palm species native to the region, and it's been harvested as a wild crop there for thousands of years. For that reason, it's harvested as a wild crop, but also produced at a range of scales all the way up to these big plantations. So it gave us an opportunity to understand what's the system like here, and are there ways to improve the sustainability, and is that similar to what's going on in Southeast Asia? And there is this direct link to mills, because you do have to process it really quickly within harvesting, like within 2 days max. But there's many mills. There's no big fancy company mills in a place like Cameroon. It's tons of these either very manual press mills or something that's a little bit more mechanized, but you have hundreds of these spread across the landscape. And so we went and we figured out where all these mills are and how mechanized they are and how much they're yielding, and figured out when they were established, and figured out that a ton have proliferated in the last few decades, but they're mostly these really manual mills. So then what we did was look at where deforestation is happening relative to these mills that's associated with oil palm expansion. So using remote sensing data, we mapped this out, and the areas in red are areas that were forest that were converted directly to oil palm. Areas in green are some other kind of agricultural system or some other land cover type that was converted to oil palm. So about 2/3 of oil palm is coming from forest areas, so it is contributing to deforestation. And when we looked at that, it was happening outside these big company plantations. So there are companies that are leased land that are allowed to grow it. So we expected to see most of the clearing happening in those concession boundaries, but a lot of it was happening outside of that, indicating that it's a lot of small-scale producers doing a lot of clearing. So we wanted to better understand why that was happening and where. We also took this mill data, right, that we had gone around the entire region and looked at, said where are these mills and how does that relate to where the clearing is happening. So these larger dots, there's should be five larger dots. Those are big mechanized company mills. The smaller ones are all these different smaller manual mills. And what we found is that oil palm expansion was about 10% more likely with every kilometer increase to proximity of an informal mill. So these smaller, more manual, not regulated mills that are popping up in a lot of people's backyards, that's where most of the clearing is happening. And for every decrease in the mill extraction rate, so the yield capabilities of that mill, that also increases the probability of deforestation. So what does that all mean? We did this work with a lot of surveys with people as well to understand who these farmers were and why they were producing and why they were expanding and the costs associated with clearing forests. And just to kind of synthesize that really briefly, we did hear from them that, and in addition to what we were seeing in the remote sensing data, a lot of expansions happening near these informal mills, and the deforestation is near the lowest yielding mills. We're seeing low crop yields on these people's farms and at these mills. So there's this desire, people are producing this for subsistence purposes or for income. And they're going to need to increase income or want to increase income. To do that, these yields are so low on their farms and at these mills. So the best available option in their minds is to expand, right, to clear more area. There was also this really interesting point from most people we talked to that they preferred informal mills. I'm not going to go into that in detail right now, but that opened up a whole new set of questions about preferences for access to credit systems and access to loan systems. And there's a whole kind of enterprise and community and finance system built into these informal mills that really led to incentivizing farmers to go to those mills even though they were really low yielding. So that's something I'm continuing to work with collaborators on, although a lot of people with expertise that I don't have taken it in other directions. And we put together a briefing, a policy brief on the implications of this, and they're now continuing a lot of research to better understand some of those other questions that arose. I'm working with other collaborators to expand this kind of work into another region to think more about other types of drivers of land use change, and then also thinking about mapping and understanding the direct carbon implications. So how much carbon are we losing from this system when this land is being cleared? But again, are there other kind of really nuanced things we need to understand about why people are clearing land and how that's connected to their access to markets or access to finance or decisions to crop certain types of agricultural crops? So this is ongoing work. Now I want to move into a different direction to think about the impacts of this kind of land use clearing on remaining forests. And so I'm going to move us back over to now Southeast Asia, where most of this oil palm expansion has been happening, and talk about this kind of in the context of edge effects. So I showed you this earlier. This is an oil palm plantation in the foreground, and it's about 10 meters tall. And then you go to the edge of this forest, and these forests get much taller, and there's a huge amount of heterogeneity and the species diversity that corresponds to the differences in tree heights. And there's this edge effects research that has been done for a long time and trying to understand, okay, at these really harsh edges, for example, this agricultural forest edge, there's got to be impacts on all sorts of things. In the case of what I'm interested in, thinking about kind of ecosystem function and carbon cycling and things like that. But because of how much degradation and deforestation has happened across the tropics, these edges you might think are kind of rare. They're actually incredibly common. About 20% of remaining tropical forests are now within just 100 meters of an edge, right? Because there's so much fragmentation that's been happening. So these kinds of questions and understanding the implications are really important. So we did this work in Sabah, which is a state of Malaysian Borneo, and we looked across all of these different white point locations, which are edge sites where oil palm directly comes up against forest. And just to give you a sense for the kinds of ecosystem dynamics we're thinking about with these edge effects, it can be almost as if there's kind of an extreme drought-like condition perpetually along this edge because of the different environmental conditions that play out there. So we usually see increases in light, wind, vapor pressure deficit, and soil and air temperatures, and a decrease in soil moisture. And so that can lead to things like tree mortality along the edges, more sun penetrating the system, light penetrating the system, which is otherwise very light limited. And you can get things like increased tree mortality and changes in productivity, sometimes species composition shifts. So this is the framework we were starting from to understand how deforestation affects ecosystem structure and function, and do those effects vary over space and time. And this was done in collaboration with a lot of folks. The data we used here is, again, it's one of these kinds of remote sensing data I use. In this case, it was from an airborne platform where we have a LiDAR system on the airplane as one sensor. And that allows us to actually, it's a laser that shoots down a signal, and the energy returns from that give us a point cloud of information that allow us to rebuild and reconfigure and reconstruct the structure of that system. We can do a whole bunch of stuff with that. We can get information about the height of that canopy and the vegetation dynamics. We can also directly estimate carbon in that system. Another sensor on board is it's called a hyperspectral sensor. It's a passive sensor. So every object on the Earth's surface is absorbing and reflecting or re-emitting energy, even us, okay? And so that sun's energy is hitting things like plants. The plants are doing something with it. There's reflected energy coming back. Our ability to understand what that reflected energy is telling us can give us insight into the biophysical and chemical structure of those objects. So we use that in this case to estimate these different plant traits that are particularly of interest because they relate to plant growth strategies. So leaf mass per area, leaf nitrogen, and leaf phosphorus tell us about different species that have different growth strategies that could make them more or less responsive in different ways to these kinds of edge effects. So this involves a ton of field work as well. It's not just data coming from this airplane, but it's going out and collecting a lot of data and being able to actually link the data from those leaves on the ground with those models, with the remote sensing data through models. So what we were interested in here was looking at how these variables we're able to get from these remote sensing data change as a function of distance to edge. So 0 here is your forest agriculture edge. And as you move along the x-axis, you're moving further into the forest, okay, away from that edge. So we're wondering, okay, does something change dramatically, like carbon? Will it decline as you get closer to that edge? And what we saw is that it did. So here you're seeing the average across all of those white points. I showed you all these different sites. The average is that solid, thicker white line. And all the variation across sites are those dotted lines. So we did see that there were consistent declines in above ground carbon as you got closer to an edge. There was variation in that. Declines persisted on average about 100 meters into a forest, but they could be as short as 35 meters to as far as 300 meters. And the amount of carbon declines, above ground carbon declines, was a little bit different. And we wanted to understand, of those other things that are varying, which corresponded to those declines in carbon. That cartoon I showed you earlier suggested that a lot of the literature thinks that kind of points to forest mortality, tree mortality happening on those edges, and that leading to kind of a change in system dynamics. We expected to see a lot more canopy gaps because trees would be dying along that area. We saw that in some cases, but it wasn't a very pronounced effect. It was only at about 40% of the sites, and I would have expected that to be true at all of these edges. But we did see increases in canopy height. So the trees actually were, decreases in canopy height. Trees were lower along these edges, and this leaf mass per area was lower, which that is, you can think about it kind of as like the thickness of leaves. So this I'll come back to in a second. We also saw leaf phosphorus increase along the edge. So these two things in particular, this makes sense, right? Maybe you're getting crown damage, but these two things, the leaf mass per area and the leaf phosphorus really got me to wondering what's going on with the tree species right here, and could it have anything to do with, in the case of phosphorus, agricultural applications, and that phosphorus is running off into that system, or are there tree species that have different ways of cycling phosphorus that are now growing through from the understory that we're starting to see from the sensors? So this is the kind of thing where we looked at this in a little bit more detail to try to understand how much variation there was across these edge effects, and it seems like more questions emerged than were answered. In part, we found the magnitude of carbon decline amplified with time, so that longer an edge was there, the stronger that impact was on carbon and these other traits. But then these also varied a lot with forest type. So again, coming back to not treating tropical forests as a single thing, they're hugely varying. And I use this term forest type to refer to different kinds of forests. You might think of a redwood forest versus an open oak scrubland here in California. Those are different forest types. They're both forests, right? We have really different forest types in the tropics, and we saw different edge responses across those different forest types. And so this is something where I think those two traits I pointed to and these results are leading us into a lot of other research that's trying to better understand how do we characterize these differences in forest types and actually better understand what those patterns that we're seeing here actually mean in terms of mechanism. We're not actually able to get at a lot of mechanism with these large remote sensing analyses. Let's see where we are in time. One other kind of point on this section before I talk about future work and ongoing work is now sticking with this forest types, if we could better map these and characterize these across the landscape, could we then identify locations to do more on the ground work to understand why are these ecosystems different in terms of species composition, in terms of response to change? It's something, if you think about a lot of the work across the Amazon where people are starting to recognize that there's been people in those systems for thousands and thousands of years, and there's variation in tree species diversity that could in fact be linked to how people use those systems, both in present day but for thousands of years. Just like a lot of different animals in these systems that are dispersing seeds, there's a lot of people and human communities that have used a lot of these trees for food and for different practices who have actually actively led to different species in different locations, kind of resulting in some of these differences in forest types. So there's a lot of work to be done to kind of understand how different are these tropical ecosystems and what underpins those differences in terms of evolutionary differences, kind of longer human histories in these systems, and then present day impacts on these systems. So one of the things we're doing right now is trying to actually map these different ecosystems with the goal of then being able to go in and do additional work on the ground. So this is in this same forest reserve, and we're using the same airborne data and just asking of the data, can we characterize these differences that we know to be true based on forest inventory plots? And the long and the short answer is yes, we can. These are different systems. These are the forest ecosystems, and the colors, the pixelated colors, are different forest types that have been mapped, and they correspond, in this case, to different plot locations in white, pink, and black. And then in this case, we found one single large plot that characterizes that all as one single forest type, and we're now trying to better understand if we should be breaking that out into different forest types. But coming back to those traits that I talked about, these plant traits that tell us about different growth strategies of these plants, we do see that those vary in really interesting and important ways. These are the leaf mass per area across these different mapped forest types: foliar phosphorus, foliar nitrogen, this nitrogen to phosphorus ratio, and then canopy height, and then LAI is this metric leaf area index that tells us about how much light is penetrating the system, which is actually quite different across different forest ecosystems. But when we actually take that and look at that with respect to kind of these ecosystem growth and mortality rates, they're very different across these systems that correspond in ways that are quite intuitive to these traits that we're seeing in the ecosystem. So this is early work that I think has a lot of unpacking to do still, but with big implications for kind of being better able to characterize these systems in ways that more accurately represent the diversity of function. Okay, so the last thing I want to do in just a few minutes is talk about the opportunities, just some of the opportunities I see for improved social-ecological systems integration to understand particularly Congo Basin tropical forests in response to climate change. So this is a paper that came out in Nature a couple years ago, really calling for a need to invest in science in the Congo Basin region relative to the Americas and Southeast Asia. It's been incredibly underfunded and undersupported and under-resourced. So this was work that really tried to make a call for that, in part pointing to an effort that was led by Brazil in the 1990s called LBA, the Large-Scale Biosphere Experiment in Amazonia, which resulted in a huge amount of science that came out about and from that region, but also capacity building, really training a whole cohort of scientists from that region that have since gone on to be leaders in science about and from and for the region. So this is a call that harked back to that and kind of really made a cry for the need for something of that scale in Central Africa. And I don't know how many of you know, but we actually have the Congo Basin Institute here at UCLA, and I'm the co-director of that as of last year, which I feel very lucky to be a part of that, because it can be really challenging to work in a lot of these places, I think, as a lot of you know, and it's really valuable to have long-term research partnerships in these places, and this is something we're doing at the Congo Basin Institute. I've worked in this region for a long time, as have others who are part of the Congo Basin Institute, and we've built out formalized partnerships that are meant to support primarily researchers from the region doing work in the region, but also supporting international collaboration. So I just want to talk about a few things that we're doing there. So these are just some photos that highlight the range of projects. So this is Ernest in the top right is actually just pointing to a tree here that's a part of a long-term phenology study looking at how these trees are responding to climate change in the form of kind of their fruiting and flowering and leafing signals and timing. That's very linked to a lot of local knowledge about these species as well, which comes to this photo in the top left. This is a woman from a community we work with that's actually a Baka community. These are folks who have traditionally lived in these forests but have since been kind of kicked out, although that's changed recently. But likanos, or storytelling, is a big part of their community. And that has been a really important way of transmitting knowledge from one generation to the next, and is really being lost for a lot of reasons, partly because people have not been living in those systems, but also because a lot of younger people are interested in moving to urban areas and having access to education and technology. And so I'll actually skip ahead. At the request of this community, we've worked with them to build out and support this School for Indigenous and Local Knowledge. So here you're actually seeing Moise in the hat here, working with a couple of younger youth from the community, and they do regular data collection that is linked to this phenology work, but kind of coming from their interest in retaining knowledge around the fruiting and flowering and leafing timing and how that's important to resources that their community depends upon. But they're also keenly interested in bringing that into science and kind of hearing how that integrates with some of the things we're interested in. And so we're spending a lot of time through Silk supporting knowledge transmission through storytelling, as well as data collection, inspired by and kind of interested in from the community level, and then working where they're interested to kind of expand out into other projects so that especially the youth can kind of stay interested and involved. And so linking back to the kind of work I do, we also are collecting a lot of drone data to look at this same plot. We have drone data every 2 weeks that we're collecting. So we can pair the information they're getting from below with binoculars with what we're seeing on top of the canopy and changing every couple weeks, and we're trying to connect those and see, what new information is emerging from that. This comes back to some of that work here, so just to build on that a little bit more. This comes again with regular monthly tree phenology monitoring from these ground observations where a whole group will go out from the community led by an elder, and then there's this capacity building component where this has really come from the youth kind of wanting to be involved in research and learning how to use different pieces of equipment, and continue with kind of learning the techniques that tie into the community knowledge that's important, that's coming from a lot of the elders, but wanting to be a part of different scientific research projects as well.
What does the word phenology mean?
Great question. I should have made that more clear. So phenology means, it's a catch-all term for the changing in timing of things, right? And when I'm talking about phenology, I'm talking about plant phenology. So changing in, like, when you want to understand when something's flowering or fruiting or leafing, what I'm referring it to is, say here, there's jacaranda trees all across LA, right? Those trees don't flower every day. They flower at a certain time of year. It's usually around the same time of year. With climate change, we're able to use that information collected over many, many, many years to see how that's changing in response to things like climate change. And that has big implications because it's a window into how that ecosystem is responding. In the case of these communities, they're really concerned about when certain things are fruiting and flowering because that's potentially food they use or medicine they use, or it's linked to animals that depend on that, and that's the food or some resource they use. So there's all these intimate connections with the timing of these systems, and phenology is just referring to monitoring the timing. Good question. Yeah, sorry I didn't explain that. I think, the last thing I'll mention is, two last things I'll mention, they're tied together. This is a project that is working, again, with a lot of those folks from these Baka communities, as well as a lot of folks from other communities, which are Bantu communities. We can get into that if people have questions about that. Quite distinct communities in this same small region who have otherwise not really worked together a lot, and through projects like this are starting to work more collaboratively, and again are bringing knowledge about these different animals, and in this case we're interested in thinking about the roles that these different taxa play, these animals play in dispersing seeds. One thing that I didn't mention before that's potentially really different about African tropical forests is that they have these a lot of tree species that are dependent on animals for dispersal, more so than in the neotropics. And there's also a lot of big megafauna like elephants, which we're not actually measuring and monitoring here, but we are in other projects that disperse really large seeded trees with these really high wood density. But this is getting at trying to understand the processes, right? When we think about conservation, we often think about species or places, but there's more and more, I think, a recognition that we need to be conserving processes, these entire systems. Otherwise, you might try to prioritize conserving one thing, not realizing you're losing a really fundamental component of the system. So this is really a lot of work with a grad student here at UCLA and a lot of folks from the community to monitor these different taxa that we know are important for dispersing these seeds, to understand where are they moving, when are they moving, why are they moving, what seeds are they actually eating, how can we better understand this process with a goal of conserving a process like seed dispersal. And that also is tied to, this is the last thing I'll mention, this project that the Congo Basin Institute leads, which is called the Ebony Project. So one of these really important trees, important culturally, also important for carbon, is ebony. It's a really beautiful hardwood that's been over-harvested, unsustainably harvested. And if you talk to a community member about a reforestation or a restoration project and you say, here's this tree that we think is really important, we want to pay you to plant it, but it's not going to mature for 300 years. That's really meaningless to somebody who is not going to be around to see the benefits of that, right? And otherwise doesn't necessarily, in some of these communities there is a lot of cultural connection to ebony, but they can't eat it, they can't sell it, it's not something that's going to help them in their daily lives. So we're trying to work with communities to better understand what could restoration look like from your perspective. And so we're doing an approach that integrates some of these process priority species with, for example, fruit trees that are really important for local consumption. There's a lot of incredible tree species in these spaces too, in these systems that people use that aren't necessarily cropped species, but provide a lot of what we often refer to as non-timber forest products, fruits and leaves and roots and things like that that people will harvest. And we're trying to kind of support market systems for that to make that more sustainable as well. So these are the kinds of things we're actively working on that get almost, there's a lot of research going on, but there's a lot of applied work as well. And I think a lot of different kinds of research that could be done that we're just barely starting to scratch the surface with. And so with that, I want to just acknowledge a lot of people who also have contributed to this work. It's definitely not just me. And I know this was a fire hose of information. So again, my goal here was to give you an overview of a lot of the different kinds of projects we work on, and hopefully we can take the conversation in a direction that's most useful and interesting to you all. So thank you.